Hey guys, tonight we're pulling on a thread, quite literally, and following it all the way back to the chilly slopes of northern Italy in the winter of 1797. You're shivering beneath a damp wool greatcoat, trudging through mud and musket smoke as the Battle of Rivoli drags on. The air smells like gunpowder, wet leather, and whatever passed for breakfast in the French army. Your gloves are long gone, your hands are numb, and the coat that's supposed to protect you? The buttons keep popping open. And that's when you spot him. A short, sharp-eyed commander with a tricorn hat and a deep scowl. Napoleon Bonaparte, barely 30, already dressed like he means to rewrite the world. But even in the chaos of battle, his coat is perfectly fastened. Every brass button gleaming, every pocket strategically placed. You can't help but notice, and you wouldn't be alone. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop your location and what time it is where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because here's the thing, Napoleon didn't just wear buttons. He weaponized them, obsessed over them, designed them. He once reportedly stopped an entire review of troops because a soldier's coat was missing a cuff button. That's the kind of man who looks at your epaulets and silently judges your life choices. Back at Rivoli, the French are outnumbered and freezing, and logistics are, let's be generous and say, sketchy. The Austrian army, better supplied but spread thin, is trying to push through the narrow valley. And here's you, tired, underfed, and trying to keep your coat shut against the wind with frozen fingers. That is, until Napoleon rides past, cloak fluttering, coat so neatly buttoned it's practically smug. He's not just giving orders, he's visually shouting discipline. Historians still argue whether this battlefield attention to uniform detail came from pure practicality or pure ego. But one thing's clear, Napoleon believed that presentation was power, and a soldier's appearance could be the difference between morale and mutiny. See, those buttons? They're not just decoration. They signal order, rank, supply. You've got buttons? That means the army's running well enough to afford uniform finishing touches. No buttons? That means someone in the quartermaster's office is either drunk, broke, or both. And it wasn't just the big brass ones lining your chest. Even the tiny sleeve buttons mattered. Legend has it, here comes your first weird tidbit of the night, that Napoleon added buttons to cuffs so soldiers would stop wiping their noses on their sleeves. You laugh, but try marching across Europe with a cold and no handkerchief. Another theory? The buttons made sleeves too stiff to double as tissues or soup napkins. Either way, no one wants snot-streaked soldiers in the imperial lineup. Napoleon's need for visual perfection extended beyond the battlefield. Once, during a diplomatic dinner, he reportedly corrected a guest's coat alignment mid-sentence. Gently but firmly, imagine being told by the most powerful man in Europe that your lapel is crooked. You'd rethink your life. The general's own coats, usually dark blue with white facings and those signature brass buttons, were tailored to the inch. Some accounts suggest he even carried a personal measuring ribbon to inspect uniforms. That's one way to kill the vibe at a regimental ball. By the time he became first consul, then emperor, Napoleon had established a visual identity that was as tightly buttoned as his coat. His uniforms became instantly recognizable, and soldiers took pride in mimicking them, if they could afford the tailor. But here's where things get odd again. Napoleon wasn't fond of changing clothes. He reportedly owned multiple identical jackets, all cut and buttoned the same, to give the illusion that he wore the same one constantly. A kind of proto-cartoon character logic. Same outfit, every day, eternal branding. Steve Jobs would have been proud. You're starting to understand now, standing on the muddy banks outside Rivoli, that the buttons aren't just keeping the cold out. They're holding the legend together. One scholarly debate that pops up from time to time asks whether Napoleon's fixation with uniforms came from a deeper insecurity. After all, he was a Corsican outsider who climbed French ranks quickly, maybe too quickly for the aristocratic officers around him. Some suggest his emphasis on buttons, polish, and pockets was his way of rewriting status from fabric outward. Others argue it was simply brilliant psychological warfare. If your troops look like a disciplined, finely stitched wall of brass and wool, they feel stronger. And sometimes, feeling strong wins the day before the first musket fires. So here you are, coat still flapping, watching Napoleon adjust a soldier's collar mid-campaign. It would be absurd if it didn't work. The Austrians retreat, the French cheer, and Napoleon, legend growing, makes a mental note to commission another uniform just like the one he wore today. Same color, same number of buttons, same storm-beating, authority-wearing silhouette. And maybe, just maybe, you start buttoning your coat a little more carefully from that day forward. You're back at camp now, stomach growling like a disgruntled musket, and you reach into your coat, only to find nothing. No apple, no biscuit, no crumpled love note from that girl in Lyon who said she'd wait. Why? Because your military-issued coat, like most in the French army at the time, has no pockets. A pocketless soldier, in Napoleon's world, is not just inconvenienced. He's exposed, vulnerable, and very, very hungry. It wasn't always this way. In the 18th century, many military coats were designed for style over function. Pockets were sometimes fake, just decorative flaps sewn shut to give the illusion of usefulness, which is great if you're waltzing through Versailles, less great when you need somewhere to stash flint, coins, or emergency cheese. But Napoleon? Oh, he hated inefficiency. He was the kind of man who'd reorganize your sock drawer at sword point. Once he rose through the ranks, he began to fix things. Uniforms became his canvas, and the lack of pockets? That was an error he meant to erase. There's a not-so-famous moment, glossed over in most biographies, when he reportedly scolded a quartermaster not for a late supply train, but for delivering coats that looked like they belonged on idle bankers. You try telling that to a man with chilblains who just wanted somewhere to hide his hands. Historians still debate whether Napoleon's push for functional pockets was deliberate reform or a happy accident born of sheer military necessity. Some say his obsession with battlefield efficiency naturally extended to clothing. Others claim he just couldn't stand loose, flapping cloth and wanted everything tight, neat, and self-contained. Whatever the reason, things started to change. You begin noticing coats arriving with deep, warm side pockets. Not the fashionable horizontal slits you see on modern blazers. No, these are angled for easy access on horseback. Perfect for stuffing in a letter, a pipe, or a pinch of tobacco. Pockets become status symbols and survival tools. You're no longer just a coat wearer. You're a pocket haver. And in Napoleon's army, that means you're somebody. One fellow in your regiment, Gaston, a wiry man with more mustache than morals, manages to smuggle 3 pastries and a small flask of brandy into a single pocket. You ask him how. He just winks and says, "The Emperor provides." But the real turning point comes when specialized pockets start appearing. You hear whispers of artillerymen with hidden pouch linings stitched to hold wicks, messengers with sewn-in map slips, dragoons with pockets perfectly fitted for pistol tools. And suddenly, the uniform isn't just clothing, it's gear. You remember the thrill of your first real pocket, the warmth, the convenience, the novelty of casually slipping your hand inside like some kind of French aristocrat who doesn't have to march 20 miles at dawn. It was glorious. It was empowering. One quirky design Napoleon endorsed, which modern tailors still raise eyebrows at, was the breast cargo pocket. A deep interior fold meant to hold papers close to the heart. Romantic, right? Until it's raining, and now your orders look like abstract watercolor. There's also talk that Napoleon's personal valet once had to resew 7 different hidden compartments into a single overcoat. Why 7? Because the emperor didn't want to choose which documents to carry. Or snacks. Possibly both. And yet, even as these innovations took hold, there were limits. Soldiers still grumbled about tight seams, about coats that looked good on parade but split when you bent too far. There's a tale, likely exaggerated, but delightful nonetheless, of a cavalry officer whose pocket stitching ripped mid-charge, showering the field with hard candies and coins. But for all the fabric malfunctions, the change was unmistakable. Napoleon's army was transforming into a mobile, well-dressed machine. And pockets? They were the unsung gears. Still, not everyone embraced the change. Some old-school generals scoffed at the gadget coats, calling them distractions from discipline. Men don't win wars with storage space. One is rumored to have grumbled. They win them with steel. To which one young lieutenant replied, "Yes, but steel needs oil. And where do you keep your oil?" Scholars still argue whether the pocket movement directly contributed to campaign success, or merely offered psychological comfort to cold, tired men. Was it strategy or symbolism? You don't know. But you do know this. That first time you tucked a crust of bread safely away and ate it hours later under cover of night, dry, intact, and smugly warm, it felt like a miracle. Like civilization itself had folded into wool and stitching. And from that moment on, you became a pocket evangelist. You started noticing other armies. Prussians with clunky flap pockets, Russians with crude belts and sack pouches. They looked like amateurs. Napoleon's troops, by contrast, glided into battle with their secrets literally in their sleeves. And your coat? It's become your second skin. A mobile desk, a snack drawer, a comforting hug from the state. So next time someone asks you what made Napoleon such a genius, you might not talk about tactics or treaties. You might just pat your pocket and say, This right here. Because wars are won with good planning, true. But a place to hide your last biscuit? That might just save your soul. The sun hasn't risen yet, and already you're being screamed at by a man whose epaulets outshine his personality. Welcome to uniform inspection, imperial style. You stand stiff in line, freezing while General de Wimpfen, a name that practically begs to be tripped over, picks lint off someone's collar like it's a national threat. Then he gets to you. He pauses, his eyes narrow, and then he reaches out and slowly polishes one of your brass buttons with his own cuff. Somewhere you suspect Napoleon would approve, because by now it's not just about having buttons, it's about how those buttons gleam. After the reforms to coats and pockets began catching on, Napoleon's next fixation became something far more granular: control over tailoring itself. You've heard whispers in the barracks that he once spent half an hour lecturing his personal tailor about the exact number of stitches in a buttonhole. Whether or not that's true, historians still argue whether the tailor existed or was a stand-in for a whole guild of grumpy Parisian artisans. What is confirmed is that Napoleon micromanaged uniforms to an almost comic degree. You wouldn't think someone fighting half of Europe would have time to approve thread-dye swatches, but this is Napoleon. The man could plan a military campaign and a fashion collection simultaneously. Back in Paris, a new Ministry of War uniforms, yes, that became a thing, began issuing detailed mandates. Colors, cuts, fastenings, cloth weight. Buttons made of polished brass or pewter, embossed with regimental numbers or imperial eagles. And always, they had to shine, preferably enough to reflect a battlefield sunrise or blind a mildly curious goat. You're issued a regulation jacket with 17 buttons. 17. And heaven help you if one goes missing. Buttons weren't just decorative, they were counted, tracked, and expected to be uniform. That's the whole point of uniforms. After all, there's even a brief and deeply unpopular initiative requiring officers to carry extra buttons in their saddlebag. For emergencies, like some kind of fashion paramedic. One of your comrades, Jacques, develops a nervous twitch and begins compulsively polishing his buttons every night with a mixture of ash and spit. He claims it keeps the sergeants happy and the lice confused. But here's the kicker: the materials mattered too. Napoleon insisted that local French manufacturers produce buttons. No outsourcing to English metalworkers, no cheap imports from Prussia. The empire had to look the part, and that meant supporting domestic industry. An economic power move dressed in literal brass. There's a fringe tidbit from an old veteran, possibly mad, possibly a genius, who insists that Napoleon could identify regiments by sound, listening to the way their buttons clinked as they marched. That's probably nonsense, but the idea is strangely believable. Even more eccentric was the development of what's now referred to by collectors as the Bonaparte button protocol. Under this unofficial system, buttons were laid out to mirror rank and function. For example, cavalry jackets used tighter button spacing to prevent flapping at speed. Artillerymen got reinforced backing so sparks wouldn't melt their closures mid-blast. Light infantry, their buttons were sewn at a slight angle for faster fastening. None of this is entirely documented, of course, but modern reenactors love arguing about it on forums. Historians still debate whether these uniform evolutions were the result of direct imperial order or the natural creativity of field tailors. Either way, the effect was the same. Every jacket became a talking point, a symbol of status, a walking resume in wool. And then there's Napoleon's own coat, possibly the most overanalyzed garment in European history. Long, slim, and slightly worn, his gray greatcoat became iconic. Some biographers speculate he deliberately avoided flamboyant fabrics so he'd stand apart from the peacock officers around him. Others argue it was just personal preference, a holdover from his Corsican modesty. Either way, it worked. Soldiers said they could spot him instantly by the silhouette. But don't let the simplicity fool you. Napoleon's coat was tailored to within a centimeter of its life. One tail seam was allegedly let out slightly to allow for easier horseback mounting. The button placement, precise and symmetrical, was repeated across multiple identical garments. This wasn't just clothing. It was armor, brand, and stage costume all rolled into one. You see it clearly now, standing outside the stables at daybreak, watching an aide-de-camp frantically reattach a missing cuff button with shaking fingers. There's fear in the air, not of enemy fire, but of appearing unkempt. That's the culture Napoleon built. A culture where discipline started not with shouting, but with stitching. And weirdly, it kind of works. You begin to walk straighter, check your buttons instinctively, even start noticing the state of other people's uniforms. You feel it in your bones. When you look sharp, you act sharp. One evening, as you sit by the fire, you hear a senior officer mutter, "An army that can polish brass can win battles." It sounds ridiculous, and maybe it is, but it's also deeply, uncomfortably true, because an empire stitched together with thread and order doesn't unravel easily. And buttons? Buttons are the seams that hold the illusion together. So when your jacket starts to fray, you don't wait for orders. You fix it, you polish, you align, because Napoleon's watching, even if he's miles away. And heaven forbid he sees your top button undone. The first time you see someone use a uniform pocket as a makeshift table, it's oddly poetic. A tired sergeant, hunched under a tree, balances a wedge of cheese and a tin spoon in his left chest pocket like it's a buffet. You're both exhausted, filthy, and covered in what might be gravy or might be gunpowder. But you look at him and think, that's genius. Because by now, the pocket isn't just a pocket. It's power. Napoleon understood this too. And not just in the literal sense. Sure, pockets were useful for maps, food, and the occasional smuggled playing card, but they were also a quiet statement. I'm equipped. I'm valuable. I have things worth keeping close. You start noticing that officers have more pockets than privates. Not just more of them, but better ones. Some are velvet-lined. Some button shut with elaborate flaps. One colonel swans around with a pocket that seems dedicated to nothing but oranges. You've never seen him eat one, but they're always there. It's as if the fruit itself is part of his rank. And the pocket hierarchy doesn't stop at fruit. There's a distinct difference between pockets used for utility and pockets used for display. The general's aide might tuck a message into a secret interior fold, while a major flashes his embroidered pocket lining every time he reaches for a quill. One says, "I'm busy doing things." The other whispers, "I outrank you in both silk and ink." Historians still debate whether this pocket stratification was deliberate policy or a naturally occurring status phenomenon. But either way, you start learning how to read a man by his coat. Those with deep pockets, literally, often carry confidential orders, sealed letters, or coded tokens. The ones with shallow, decorative pouches, often the loudest at dinner, but somehow never around when there's actual work. One memorable evening, you stumble upon an officer snoring on a cot with half his worldly possessions spilling from a massive inner pocket. A miniature chessboard, 2 theater tickets from Vienna, and a spoon with someone else's initials. It's like a small museum of personal history, all stitched into a uniform. But it's not just the officers. Even your fellow infantrymen are getting creative. One friend conceals a whetstone in his sleeve lining. sharpens his knife in secret like a kitchen ninja. Another hides a tiny woodcut of his mother inside a flap no bigger than a coin. Pockets become shrines, secret compartments of longing, strategy, and sometimes dessert. And then there's the snack pocket. Oh, the snack pocket. Somewhere along the way, the soldiers develop a sort of sacred respect for the emergency ration compartment, usually an inner side pocket close to the ribs, where it stays warm and semi-edible. Biscuits, dried fruit, hunks of questionable sausage. They call it the last resort pouch. You protect it like a relic. You don't touch it unless things are truly dire, like post-March before payday dire. It becomes something of a superstition. Soldiers believe if you eat your last snack too early, you curse your company. One corporal refuses to eat his for 6 weeks. By the end, it looks fossilized. Still, he pats it lovingly every morning like a lucky charm. Napoleon, for his part, encouraged this personalization. He wanted his men to feel ownership over their gear. Because a man who customizes his uniform isn't just dressing for battle. He's buying into the empire. His pocket isn't just his. It's France's. There's a popular joke in the ranks. You don't carry France on your back. You carry it in your pocket, along with lint, crumbs, and at least one dead bug. Of course, not all pockets were honest. Espionage flourished under the folds. Small compartments for notes, powders, and once a frog. Long story. You don't ask. There's even a rumor of a Prussian spy who stitched a fake button onto his chest that popped open to reveal a tiny map etched on cloth. Whether that actually happened or is just wine-fueled legend, no one knows. But the idea? Deliciously plausible. And then, of course, there were the pockets designed for trickery. Officers who stitched decoy flaps to confuse pickpockets. Soldiers who lined theirs with grease to ruin a thief's hand. One lieutenant even sewed a rude message inside his outer pocket, so any enemy who rifled through it would get an unexpected insult. Bold move. Scholars still argue whether these pocket tricks were widespread or isolated cases of overenthusiastic sewing. Either way, they speak to something deeper. In Napoleon's army, uniforms were alive. Not static costumes, but adaptable tools. As campaigns stretched longer, your coat begins to sag slightly from its contents. A flint striker, a love letter, a medal you haven't earned but carry anyway. For luck. It jingles faintly when you march, and somehow that sound becomes comforting. Because your coat isn't just warm now. It remembers things. And your pockets? They hold more than supplies. They hold identity, rank, secrets. Occasionally a very squished pair. Napoleon once said, or is at least quoted as saying, historians bicker about the source. The uniform makes the man. The pocket makes him useful. And you believe it. Standing in the dawn chill, hand tucked into your coat. Not for warmth, but for reassurance. You believe it completely. You're watching a child try to march in a coat twice his size. His boots flap, his hat wobbles, and the weight of his brass buttons pulls his shoulders forward like he's already lost a battle. He's no taller than your waist, and yet, there he is in full regimental dress, proudly banging a drum half his body weight. Welcome to the curious case of the button baby soldiers. Okay, not babies, technically, but these drummer boys, some as young as 10, were fully decked out in military garb, complete with elaborately fastened jackets that jingled when they moved. Because yes, even the smallest members of Napoleon's armies got the full button treatment. You'd think someone would have taken pity and skipped the decorations. But no. If anything, the younger they were, the more ornate their uniforms became. Embroidered cuffs, gleaming brass, little velvet sashes. It's like someone tried to merge a toy soldier and a wedding cake. Historians still argue whether these fancy little outfits served a real purpose or were just theater. Some say the excess buttons helped distinguish child drummers from adult combatants, making them less likely to be targeted. Others point out the tragic flaw in that logic. On a smoky battlefield, all anyone sees is movement and noise. And if that movement is covered in bright gold buttons, well, you do the math. But let's pause for a moment on the tailoring itself. Drummer uniforms were custom-made, not just scaled down from adult sizes. They required skilled craftsmanship to ensure the buttons sat just right over tiny torsos. There's even record of one regiment commissioning a special batch of smaller buttons purely for their young percussionists. Imagine the dedication it takes to cast a brass button the size of a grape. Now imagine doing it hundreds of times because someone said, "But are they cute enough?" And you know what? The kids loved it. Most of them, anyway. The uniform made them feel important, part of something big, disciplined, and shiny. You once overheard a drummer boy named Luke whisper to another, "My coat has 9 buttons. That's 2 more than yours." Rank by tailoring. The adults weren't immune either. Officers liked to show off their mini-marching mascots. There's a story, possibly embroidered, like everything else, about a general who had his drummer boy's buttons polished daily by a valet. Not his own, just the boys. Priorities. And then there were the ceremonial parades. You're standing on a cobbled street in some recently conquered city, watching children in gold-trimmed coats lead columns of men. The drums beat slow and loud, echoing off the stone, and every button catches the sunlight like a tiny star. It's oddly hypnotic, even beautiful. And yet, you can't quite shake the weirdness of it all. Because let's be honest, what exactly is a 10-year-old doing in a military campaign? Well, the answer's complicated. Drummer boys served as signalers. Their rhythms relayed commands across the battlefield. Advance, retreat, hold, charge. Their sound carried farther than a voice could scream. And that made them essential. But it also made them targets. That's why their buttons mattered. They weren't just decorative. They were armor of a different kind, symbols of role and purpose. You weren't a child anymore. You were a buttoned cog in the imperial machine. One fringe tidbit that keeps popping up in soldiers' letters is that some drummer boys developed a superstition. They'd only play properly if their lucky button was polished. Just one. Usually on the left cuff. There's even a tale of a boy refusing to drum during a crucial maneuver until his officer stopped and polished that single button by hand. Did it save the day? Maybe. Did it become a unit legend? Absolutely. You can't help but wonder. Did Napoleon think about this when he approved the uniform regulations for children? Did he imagine these pint-sized musicians becoming living symbols of French order and empire? Or did he just love the aesthetic? Some scholars think he saw the drummer boys as miniature propaganda. A child, dressed like a soldier, marching with precision. It sent a message. France is united, disciplined, eternal, from cradle to cavalry. Others argue he didn't think about it at all, that it was just tradition, absorbed from earlier European armies with no deeper intent. But knowing what you do about Napoleon's obsession with image and detail, that seems unlikely. And then there's you, crouched beside one of these boys after a long march, helping him reattach a loose button with a borrowed needle. He's barely awake, nodding off as you work. The brass glints in the firelight. You wonder what stories this kid will tell if he makes it home. Will he remember the battles, or just the rhythm of his drum and the shine of his jacket? You pat his shoulder and send him off to sleep, hoping tomorrow he'll be just a little more child than soldier. But you know deep down that button coat has already changed him. You're elbow deep in a wooden crate, brushing aside hay and crumpled cloth. When your hand closes around something cold and metallic, you pull it out. A button. Then another. And another. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Rows of brass, steel, and tin, clinking softly like a pocket-sized battalion. Welcome to the moment you realize Napoleon didn't just like buttons, he industrialized them. Because as the French army grew, so did the need for millions of fasteners. And these weren't just any buttons. They had to meet standards. Size, shape, placement. Some bore the imperial eagle, others had regimental numbers, and some, your personal favorite, featured a solemn little N, as if the emperor himself had signed your coat. By 1805, French manufacturing was practically doing cartwheels to keep up. Towns once known for lace and ribbons suddenly found themselves producing military buttons at breakneck speed. Factories in Lyon, Paris, and even smaller communes transformed into brass stamping operations overnight. It was the Industrial Revolution, but shiny and circular. Historians still argue whether this mass production gave France a logistical edge over its enemies or just led to a surplus of decorative metal discs. Either way, there's no denying it. Buttons became a symbol of imperial might. Tiny, jingling proof that Napoleon could outfit an army of 500,000 and still make sure everyone's cuffs matched. You hear stories in camp, some true, some exaggerated, about button shortages in rival armies. British soldiers using bone fasteners, Austrians with mismatched toggles, a Prussian lieutenant allegedly using painted acorns to hold his coat shut during a supply delay. Your own buttons? Gleaming brass, stamped with authority. But what makes you pause is the shift in meaning. These little objects, once simple closures, have become propaganda tokens. Literal badges of honor. Napoleon's face might not be on them, usually, but his vision is ordered, efficient, unrelenting. You remember a corporal named Émile who lined his hat with spare buttons, just in case. First, you thought it was absurd. But then winter came, and Émile bartered a single imperial button for a whole loaf of bread. That's when it clicked. You weren't just wearing buttons. You were armed with them. This fringe tale floats around too, about a deserter caught by a patrol who denied being French, until someone pointed at his buttons. The imperial eagle gave him away. No words needed, just brass. And the buttons weren't limited to soldiers. Civilians got in on it too. Merchants stitched miniature replicas to coat cuffs to show loyalty. Children had toy uniforms with tiny facsimiles. Some tailors even added secret messages under button flaps, embroidered in code. There's a persistent rumor, no proof, but delightful, that one Parisian dressmaker invented a proposal pocket, a hidden slot behind a decorative button for smuggling love letters. Romance, courtesy of Napoleon. The emperor himself, of course, set the example. His personal buttons, custom-made, matched in sets, rumored to be inspected daily. His travel wardrobe included spares, sorted in velvet-lined boxes like tiny golden cookies. Once, he reportedly delayed a portrait sitting because the wrong buttons had been sewn on. The painter? Less amused than you'd expect. Still, Napoleon understood the visual impact. He once rode into a newly captured city in full uniform, light glinting off each button like a walking chandelier. The message was clear. This is France now. And France looks good. You start noticing the effect during parades. Children cheer at the sight of polished coats. Old men straighten as you pass, eyes catching on those familiar fastenings. It's not the weapons that impress them. It's the presentation. There's an open scholarly question about whether Napoleon's obsession with uniformity helped solidify French national identity. Did the matching buttons make men feel part of something greater? Did they build esprit de corps? Or was it all just a very shiny placebo? You don't know. But you do know that on days when morale dips, when rations run thin or boots leak, it helps to see your buttons still gleaming. It reminds you that you belong somewhere, that you are seen. And on nights when you're on watch, coat buttoned up to the throat, stars overhead and silence stretching forever, you find yourself toying with one of those little discs, turning it between your fingers, listening to its soft clink. It's not just a fastener. It's a piece of the empire, one you can hold, one that shines even in the dark. The first time you notice it, you're not even thinking about it. Just sitting on a hillside, trying to uncrumple a letter from home, when your lapel keeps folding itself over the ink. Annoying. So you reach up, press it down, and feel the tug of a small, stiff button. This ornamental but stubborn, like everything Napoleon touched. That's when it hits you. This man even had opinions about lapels. Because, of course, he did. You learn quickly that lapels, those flappy bits of folded cloth on your chest, are no small matter in Napoleon's world. They're not just style. They're signaling devices. And in a time before fluorescent safety vests and branded morale patches, the shape and angle of your lapel can tell someone across a muddy battlefield who you are, where you belong, and how recently you had access to a halfway decent tailor. Napoleon's obsession with uniformity extended all the way up to the collarbones. He believed lapels should be sharply defined, symmetrical, and crisp enough to slice through propaganda. There's a running joke in your regiment that the lapel is the soldier's wingspan, useless for flying, but essential for looking airborne. And yet, variations abound. You start noticing differences across regiments. The grenadiers have wide, aggressively proud lapels that seem to puff their chests out. The Voltigas? Narrower, tighter folds that allow for better rifle movement. The cuirassiers? Their coats barely have lapels, buried beneath breastplates and bravado. Historians still argue whether these differences were official designations or just the handiwork of overzealous field tailors with scissors and no restraint. But the one thing that's not debated? Napoleon cared. Deeply. There's a story from the Ulm campaign, one of those war tales passed down like gospel, where the emperor allegedly halted a march to personally rebuke a colonel whose lapels drooped. Not torn, not dirty, drooped. The offense? It made the men look lazy. Imagine being berated by the most powerful man in Europe because your jacket flopped a bit. And it doesn't stop there. You begin to understand that lapel styles were often dictated by practicality and identity. Infantry lapels were fastened with buttons, not to seal the coat, but to keep the folds rigid in formation. Cavalry lapels sometimes tucked in entirely to prevent flapping at full gallop. Engineers had angular folds to allow for easier movement when crouching. Each cut had a purpose, or at least a good excuse. Of course, there were disagreements. You remember one quartermaster who insisted on issuing coats with oversized lapels to intimidate. They did no such thing. Mostly, they caught wind like sails and made the men look like badly dressed kites. But perhaps the most Napoleon-esque detail? The lapel button itself. A small, unnecessary fastener placed precisely to hold the lapel in place, even when no movement threatened it. It was like buckling your shoes before bed. But the emperor insisted. Consistency was a form of discipline. You begin to suspect that if he could have added buttons to air, he would have. Somewhere in camp, a soldier starts crafting custom lapel buttons from leftover coin blanks. You trade him a wedge of cheese for one. It's heavier than regulation, but the gleam is satisfying. You wear it secretly on the inside flap, a hidden rebellion that also makes your coat look really, really good. There's even a brief lapel rebellion among light infantry in 1808. Officers complain their men are unbuttoning lapels to stay cool in summer. One general reportedly has a tailor reinforce his men's coats with lapel stays. Think stiff wire. The results are sweaty, itchy, and deeply unpopular. One man faints during a march and blames it entirely on excessive lapel rigidity. You can't make this stuff up. And yet, there's pride in it too. You look at yourself in a polished canteen lid, lapel perfectly folded and buttoned, and realize you look like a soldier. That small touch makes a difference. It sets you apart from the farmers and laborers you were before conscription. Now you're part of something clean, controlled, imperial. If only on the outside. Napoleon knew this. He understood the power of appearance. His lapels? Impeccable. His buttons? Always aligned. There's a well-worn anecdote, possibly invented by his valet, about how Napoleon once refused to sign a treaty draft until he could fix a wrinkle in his lapel. Did it happen? No idea. But it feels true. And then there's you, a year into the campaign, fiddling with your coat in the pre-dawn dark. You've lost sleep, friends, maybe even your left boot. But that lapel is still standing, held upright by its faithful little button. It's absurd and comforting, because in a world where cannonballs fall like rain, sometimes it's nice to know your jacket won't. The snowing again, because of course it is. You're hunched under a canvas lean-to with 3 other soldiers, watching your breath curl in the air like tiny ghosts. The fire sputters. Your coat's soaked at the hem, and you've officially run out of dry socks and curses. And then it happens, again. You tug your coat shut, and the button gives way. Snaps clean off. Rolls into the mud like it's deserting the cause. You stare at the empty hole in disbelief, because now you're cold and unbuttoned. This, you realize, is the greatcoat dilemma. See, by 1809, Napoleon's army was bigger, colder, and more mobile than ever before. They were marching through varied terrain. Alps, forests, frozen plains, and their uniforms had to evolve. Enter the greatcoat. Long, heavy, and double-breasted, the greatcoat was the closest thing a soldier had to a portable bed. Thick wool, long tails, enormous collars that could turn up to protect your neck from the wind, or at least from your sergeant's shouting. The problem? These coats needed a lot of buttons. And buttons were failing. You see, these weren't your regular jacket buttons. Greatcoat buttons had to fasten through layers of damp, heavy fabric, often while your hands were stiff with cold or shaking from hunger. Add in the weight of the coat itself, soaked from rain, weighed down by frost, and you had a perfect recipe for coat malfunction. And that's when Napoleon did something very Napoleon. He summoned his quartermasters and engineers, not just tailors but military engineers, to discuss button science. Not strategy, not artillery, buttons. Historians still debate whether this summit actually occurred, or whether it's just a delightful footnote invented by bored clerks. But the result is real. Changes were made. They began experimenting with symmetrical double-breasting. Instead of fastening all buttons straight down, the coat could be closed left over right or right over left, depending on wind direction or which side hadn't yet frozen solid. This created redundancy, a coat that could still close even if you lost half your buttons. There were other tweaks too. Buttons moved slightly to reduce stress on the seams. Some regiments adopted backup hooks hidden inside the flap, in case buttons popped during a march. One particularly clever battalion added inner loop toggles, crude but effective. And warm, gloriously warm. You start hearing field-tested advice being passed down like gospel. Don't fasten the bottom 3. They drag in the mud. Reinforce the second to top. That's the one you'll always need. Rub a candle on the buttonholes to keep them from freezing shut. There's even a slightly unhinged fellow named Rousseau who swears by brushing his coat buttons with bare fat. No one knows if it works. No one wants to stand near him long enough to find out. And then there's the infamous button and blanket maneuver, invented somewhere outside Smolensk. Cold soldiers began buttoning their greatcoats shut over an extra wool blanket, using makeshift button extensions made from twine or threadbare ribbon. You try it once. It makes you look like a misshapen caterpillar. But it works, and that's what matters. Napoleon, for his part, didn't just issue these garments. He wore them, publicly, photogenically. There are multiple accounts of him riding past the line, greatcoat swirling, double-breasted and buttoned to the chin like some mythic weather god. He made the coat look heroic. You just hoped yours didn't fall apart before lunchtime. Still, not everyone was happy. Officers grumbled about the extra weight. Some refused to wear greatcoats at all, citing style over survival. One captain allegedly tossed his into a river because it flattened the epaulets. He later got frostbite. No one felt particularly bad. And yet, for the average soldier like you, the greatcoat was a godsend. If you kept it patched, kept the buttons strong, it became your portable fortress. Windbreaker, bedroll, shield. One man in your unit even fashioned a tiny flap into a pipe pocket. Luxury by military standards. There's a scholarly theory that these uniform changes contributed to Napoleon's tactical flexibility. His men could move fast, sleep rough, endure weather. They weren't pampered, but they weren't falling apart either. That coat on your back? It wasn't just about appearances anymore. It was survival gear. Still, it came at a cost. You remember the day your last greatcoat button broke during a sleet storm in Saxony. Your hands too numb to fix it, your spare thread soaked, your coat flapping like a wounded bird. That night, you didn't sleep, you just shivered in rhythm. But the next morning, you stitched a coin in place. An old sou polished to a gleam. Not regulation, not even close, but it held. And when Napoleon passed by that afternoon, riding along the line, you swear, for half a second, he looked down, saw the coin, and nodded. Maybe you imagined it. Maybe not. Either way, the coat stayed closed. You're sitting by the fire, half dozing, when someone whispers, "She kept it in her corset." That wakes you up. Not because you're scandalized, at this point you've seen worse in field latrines, but because you know exactly what they're talking about. The pocket map. You sit up straighter, cup of something warmish in hand, and listen as the tale unfolds. A courier, a woman disguised as a laundress, a map folded so small it fit between two seams of her corset lining, carried across enemy lines under everyone's nose or chest, rather. delivered just in time to reroute an entire battalion. Whether that specific tale is true, well, historians still argue. But one thing they agree on: the age of the secret pocket was in full swing. By now, you've come to understand Napoleon's obsession with pockets wasn't just about holding snacks and spare thread. It was about control of information, of image, of movement. And what better way to control those things than with hidden compartments? You learn quickly that maps, crucial ones, were often folded into palm-sized packets and slipped into concealed flaps. Officers had jackets with lining pockets so well camouflaged you could swear they were just seams. Some even had double linings, with the second layer accessed by lifting a button panel beneath the armpit. It's awkward to use. Very awkward. But you do feel slightly like a magician every time you try. And this isn't just officer flair. Even common soldiers get creative. One fellow stitches a tobacco pouch inside the lining of his collar. Another hides stolen sugar cubes under a false bottom in his cuff. One particularly paranoid artilleryman you know wears a money pouch inside his boot flap and walks with a permanent limp because of it. There's a niche but growing culture of custom covert tailoring. Quartermasters whisper about tailors who specialize in interior solutions. These are men who can sew a pouch into a boot, a button that opens like a locket, a belt with a paper-thin knife sheath. The spy world is catching on, and the lines between soldier and informant begin to blur. You're issued a new uniform for spring campaign. At first glance, it looks like every other coat. But when you press near the left hem, the fabric gives slightly. A hidden slip pocket. It's barely big enough for a card or two, but suddenly you feel upgraded. Then there are the women, seamstresses, informants, or just civilians caught up in Napoleon's expanding shadow. Many of them wear coats of their own, sometimes modified men's uniforms, sometimes peasant wraps with secret compartments sewn behind decorative panels. There's a popular myth, unverified but irresistible, about a brothel in Vienna where the madam stitched enemy correspondence into the hems of her dancers' dresses. You're not entirely sure what you do with that information, but you store it anyway, just in case. Of course, not all hidden pockets are used for noble espionage. You once caught a fellow soldier hoarding half the company's sugar ration in a flap behind his knee patch. He called it preventative logistics. You called it theft. The sergeant called it a reason to do push-ups until next Tuesday. Still, the trend continues. Hidden pockets become both a tactical innovation and a kind of gentleman's secret, quietly admired, rarely acknowledged. Napoleon naturally sets the standard. According to his valet, a man who probably knew too much about the emperor's jackets, Napoleon's personal uniforms had custom pockets for letters, snuff boxes, and, get this, a single slim pocket along the spine for folding dispatches. Some tailors claimed it was ridiculous. Others said it was brilliant. You personally don't want anything sharp near your vertebrae, but to each his own. There's also a story, one you've heard told with increasingly theatrical flair, about Napoleon pulling a full campaign map from a slit in his overcoat sleeve during a dinner with foreign dignitaries. He lays it on the table, smooths it with a gloved hand, and simply says, "Shall we begin?" Was it true? No idea. But the imagery, iconic. Open scholarly debate still surrounds just how widespread these covert compartments were. Were they official policy? Field improvisation? Fashion-forward soldiers trying to outdo one another? Some think Napoleon encouraged the culture deliberately, using pockets to promote initiative and stealth. Others believe it was more organic, tailors responding to battlefield needs as they arose. You lean toward the first. Knowing Napoleon, he probably had a chart somewhere specifying what could go in which pocket, how it should be folded, and what color thread to use on the inside seam. And really, you're not complaining. Because one night, just outside Danzig, you find yourself lost. Separated from your unit. Snow falling. You reach into the secret flap under your collar and pull out a wax-sealed message with a sketch of local terrain. You follow it. You find your unit. You don't die. All thanks to a little hidden square of cloth. So yes, next time someone mocks your fancy tailoring, you'll just smile, tap the seam of your coat, and say, "Better than a compass." There's a quiet moment during the retreat from Moscow, somewhere between frostbite and despair, when someone mutters, "I heard we're eating buttons now." You all laugh thin, exhausted laughter, but no one really denies it. Because when everything else has frozen or disappeared, the buttons are still there. And they look suspiciously edible. This is the myth of the gold button ration. One of those strange little legends that clings to Napoleon's disastrous Russian campaign like snow to a dying boot. It goes something like this. When supplies ran out and food was scarce, soldiers began boiling their brass buttons into soup, hoping to extract nutrients from the metal. Some say it was a joke. Others insist it actually happened. Historians still argue whether this was a desperate reality, a misunderstood metaphor, or just frostbite-induced madness. You personally never tried it, but you did see someone drop 3 coat buttons into a pot of boiling water, swirl it once, mutter a prayer, and then drink it. He claimed it tasted like empire. He also hallucinated a snow rabbit that gave him military advice, so you take it with a grain of icy salt. The Russian winter wasn't just cold. It was cruel in a way that peeled layers off your soul. Uniforms stiffened to boards. Blankets froze to the ground. Boots shattered like pottery. And buttons? They became lifelines, literal and symbolic. The coat you'd once obsessed over for style was now your only defense against becoming a man-shaped icicle. And every button mattered. One missing fastener and the wind had a way in. One broken thread, and suddenly your greatcoat flapped open like the wings of death itself. So soldiers protected their buttons, guarded them, mended them with string, twine, even sinew. You once tied a button back on using a strand of your own hair. Not your proudest moment, but better than freezing. And yet, there was an eerie irony. Buttons were everywhere, still gleaming, still intact, while the people wearing them fell apart. The image stuck. Soldiers collapsing in the snow, coats still neatly fastened, brass shining in the twilight. The uniform survived. The man did not. It was this paradox that probably fueled the eating myth. After all, buttons were all that remained. If not food, then at least symbols of it, round, solid, vaguely loaf-like. A cruel joke in metal. Some versions of the myth even claim that Napoleon himself, in a desperate moment, dropped a gold-plated button into a soldier's soup, saying, "This is all I have to give." A dramatic gesture, poetic even, probably false, but again, deliciously believable. One fringe tale goes even further, that some soldiers swallowed buttons on purpose, hoping to pass them later and trade them in safer territory. You don't know anyone who tried that, but there was a lot of wincing going around in those days. And then there's the story of the soup of 7 buttons. A patrol of men, stranded and starving, each gave up 1 coat button to a communal pot. The concoction was boiled, blessed, and shared. One man wept as he drank it, not because of flavor, it apparently tasted like hot pennies, but because it was the last shared act of comradeship before half the group vanished in the snow. You think about that sometimes when you hear a button clink against your belt. The sound is small but meaningful, a kind of ritual repeated every time you fasten your coat. Proof that you're still holding on, still together. Even back in Paris, word of the button rations reached the public. Some scoffed, others romanticized it. Button-themed brooches became a weirdly popular fashion item among Bonapartist sympathizers. There were even rumors, again, highly questionable, that Napoleon kept one of his campaign buttons in a velvet pouch, displayed it like a relic, and called it the meal that never was. What's certain is this: after the Russian retreat, uniform design quietly shifted. Lighter buttons, more practical fastenings, hidden hooks, sewn ties, a subtle admission that maybe, just maybe, the empire had taken its button dreams a little too far. But you kept yours. Every single one. Even the broken ones. Even the cracked brass disc you carried in your glove for weeks, pressing it between your fingers like a rosary bead. Because it wasn't really about food. It was about the absurd, beautiful, desperate dignity of fastening your coat one last time. Even when the world is frozen, the soup is empty, and all you have left is a circle of cold metal that says, "I was here." The spring in London and the cartoons are brutal. You're on leave, barely. And by some cosmic accident you find yourself in a smoky little English print shop, thumbing through a stack of political caricatures. You're in plain clothes, trying not to stand out. But there it is, right in front of you. Napoleon, tiny and scowling, wearing a comically oversized greatcoat plastered with buttons the size of dinner plates. One caption reads, "Little Boney and his button fetish, clothing an army in vanity." Another shows him sewing coats by candlelight, tongue sticking out in concentration, while his generals stand awkwardly nearby. You smirk. You're not supposed to laugh at your own emperor, but the drawing is oddly accurate, right down to the rigid lapels and those glinting rows of brass. The British, it turns out, really like making fun of Napoleon's coat, and they do it a lot. There's something about his appearance that the English can't resist skewering. The stature, the hand-in-waistcoat pose, and above all, his uniforms. They fixate on the greatcoat, mocking how he's never seen without it. One popular cartoon shows Napoleon in bed, still fully dressed, blanket tucked under his lapels, a nightcap perched over his bicorn hat. The title? Boney Dreams of Buttons. You laugh again, but this time it stings, because you've seen that coat in real life. You've worn its cousin. You know how each button is stitched with purpose, how that gray wool isn't just fabric, it's identity. Seeing it turned into a punchline by men who've never marched through Russian snow, well, it makes your fingers curl. Still, you can't help but admire the artistry. The British cartoonists are relentless. One draws a satirical, Napoleonic button shop, where terrified tailors churn out uniforms under the emperor's hawk-like glare. Another depicts the Imperial Guard halted mid-charge because someone lost a cufflink. The humor's harsh but clever. Historians still argue whether this mockery was purely for laughs or a deliberate psychological weapon. Satire, after all, can be powerful. If you reduce a man to a joke, it's easier to ignore the fact that he's conquered half of Europe. British soldiers picked up on the jokes too. They began referring to the French as button boys and mocked the rigid tailoring of their uniforms. One English sergeant wrote in his journal that capturing a French coat was almost as satisfying as taking a musket. At least that won't shoot back. But what they didn't see was what the buttons meant to you. You remember a moment in camp, a young conscript who arrived coatless after a long march. One of the older men gave him his own spare, carefully reattaching 3 loose buttons by firelight. No words, just the quiet transfer of something that mattered. That coat didn't just keep him warm, it belonged. And yet, here in this foreign city, you're seeing how the rest of the world sees it. A costume, a joke, a symbol of vanity. One cartoon even imagines Napoleon at his coronation, not with a crown, but with a giant brass button perched on his head. The subtitle reads, "His Imperial Stitchiness." You try not to snort too loudly. There's a fringe English pamphlet, clearly satirical, that suggests France's real strategy was to blind their enemies with reflections from their overly polished coats. Perhaps Bonaparte seeks not to fight but to dazzle. It declares, you'd roll your eyes if you hadn't once been told to polish your buttons twice daily during campaign season. Still, it's not all mockery. A few British fashion houses begin quietly mimicking French military designs. Tailored waistcoats with symmetrical buttons, double-breasted lapels, even the occasional greatcoat cut in the Parisian style. Of course, they rename everything. No one wants to admit they're dressing like the enemy. Even women's fashion isn't immune. You pass a shop window and see a mannequin in a navy coat dress with oversized brass buttons. An echo of Napoleon's silhouette, softened for Mayfair. The caption reads, "Imperial chic." You wonder what the emperor would think. And so you leave the print shop that day with a strange feeling, equal parts pride and melancholy. Because while they laugh at Napoleon's coat, they can't stop drawing it. That uniform, those buttons, that unmistakable posture. It's lodged in their minds like a musket ball. They can't ignore him, so they mock him. It's the only power they have left. You reach into your own coat, running your thumb along a slightly tarnished button near your ribs. It's not perfect. It never was. But it's yours. And it means something. Let them laugh. You've seen the man behind the myth. And he wears his buttons well. It starts with a ripple of gold. You're at an inspection parade, standing as still as you can while a general, somewhere between flamboyant and mildly terrifying, struts past in a uniform that could blind a crow at 50 paces. Embroidery down the cuffs, silver braid along the lapels. Epaulets so wide you're not sure he could fit through a doorway. And then it hits you. Napoleon's army has officially entered its peacock phase. Because buttons and pockets were just the beginning. Now, his tassels, his thread work, his plumage. And if you thought things couldn't get more ornate, wait until you hear the words, triple-layered bullion fringe. Napoleon's elevation to emperor didn't just change titles. It changed fashion, military fashion most of all. He understood that appearances mattered, but now he wasn't just commanding armies. He was commanding a narrative. And narrative needed sparkle. Suddenly, officers' uniforms sprout more than just buttons. They sprout statement pieces. Gold leaf embroidery snakes up sleeves. Epaulets go from subtle shoulder flaps to full-on decorative shoulder islands. One officer's uniform is so heavy with braid and ornamentation that he jokes he needs a separate valet just to put it on. He's only half joking. Historians still argue whether Napoleon encouraged this style explosion or merely tolerated it as a morale booster. Some say he preferred simpler dress and let his marshals indulge for show. Others claim he carefully orchestrated every sparkle to impress foreign courts and his own men. What's certain is this: embroidery became status. Every thread, every tassel told a story. Generals flaunted chest banners of gold. Aides-de-camp wore braided cords that looped like jewelry. Even the humble infantrymen got in on it, with tricolor piping and metallic threaded cuffs. Some of the elite units, like the chasseurs à cheval of the Imperial Guard, looked like they galloped straight out of an opera. And the buttons kept pace. Now they weren't just brass. They were engraved, enamel-filled, or plated in silver. Regimental insignia grew more elaborate. You once saw a button shaped like a lion's head, eyes painted crimson. It may have been illegal. It was definitely awesome. One fringe tale that makes its way through the ranks involves Marshal Ney showing up to a battle in a coat so ornate it briefly distracted the enemy cavalry. They thought he was part of a theater troupe. He was not. You, of course, aren't quite so glittery. Your coat still features the standard button arrangement, but there's a tiny thread of blue braid around your cuffs now. Promotion. One step closer to shoulder sparkle. But with great flair comes logistical challenges. Uniform maintenance reaches absurd new levels. Embroidery snags on everything. Polishing your buttons becomes a full-time job. And heaven help you if your epaulet fringe gets wet. It weighs as much as a soaked dachshund and smells worse. One lieutenant in your regiment spends 2 hours brushing a single silver braid before an imperial review. When Napoleon arrives, he's 20 feet away and doesn't even glance in your direction. The lieutenant looks like he might cry. Still, there's a strange satisfaction in the ritual. Lacing up, aligning buttons, dusting braid. You feel like a participant in some grand, ridiculous ballet. One where the stakes are life, death, and glitter. Some scholars believe this obsession with appearance masked deeper insecurities. Was all the embroidery a distraction from supply shortages? From rising casualties? From the emperor's dwindling luck? Perhaps. But it also worked. Civilians adored it. When troops marched through towns in full dress, children followed like it was a parade. Women threw flowers. Men stood taller. The empire didn't always win its battles, but it looked like it should. You once saw a townsperson offer a coin just to touch the gold trim on an officer's cuff. "I wanted to feel what victory feels like," he said. And Napoleon himself? He remained oddly restrained. Most days, he wore his simple gray greatcoat, a cocked hat, and his familiar brass buttons. No epaulets, no embroidery, just the essentials. It made him stand out all the more. Some thought it was humility. Others called it branding. But either way, his plain coat among a sea of over-decorated marshals made a statement. "I'm still the soldier who slept beside you in Italy." Or, more cynically, "I don't need glitter. I'm the reason you glitter." Still, when the time came for portraits or ceremonies, Napoleon could dazzle with the best of them. You've seen the famous paintings, the ermine robes, the medallions, the absolute tidal wave of embroidery. But off canvas, day to day, he stuck to the basics. Coat, buttons, quiet power. You try to follow that model. You keep your buttons polished, your coat brushed. You add one discreet stitch of red thread near your hem. for luck, for rebellion, for style. And when you're finally issued your first epaulets, modest but yours, you adjust them carefully, checking the mirror to make sure they sit just right. Because you know the truth now. This isn't just a uniform, it's a story. And every button, braid, and thread is a line in your chapter. You feel the cold before you even open your eyes. It's in your teeth, in your bones, in the stiff fabric of your greatcoat, which crackles slightly when you shift because it's frozen solid. Around you, the landscape is silent except for the occasional groan of snow under weight and the hollow cough of someone trying not to die. Welcome to Moscow, or what's left of it. Napoleon's grand invasion of Russia has unraveled faster than a threadbare buttonhole. Supplies are gone, horses are dead, the city is burned, and the army is retreating through snow so deep it swallows your boots and your hope in the same icy gulp. You try to move your fingers, and they respond like rusty hinges. Your coat, once a proud symbol of imperial might, now resembles a shrunken tent, and the buttons? Well, they're disappearing. Literally. The brass ones are brittle with frost. The cheaper tin ones snap when you try to fasten them. The fabric holes have stretched or torn. You're now holding your coat shut with a leather strap, a broken belt, and most ingeniously, a strip of wire borrowed from an abandoned cannon. Fashion innovation by desperation. You glance around and realize you're not alone. Everyone's improvising. One man has tied his lapels together with bootlaces. Another has used wax to try to glue a button in place. You swear someone else stitched a bit of dried meat into a button shape and is pretending it works. It doesn't. And this is what the Russian winter does. It doesn't just freeze your body. It erases detail. The carefully crafted edges of the empire are being sanded down by wind and snow, one brass circle at a time. Historians still debate whether Napoleon underestimated the cold or simply believed he could outpace it. Some say he imagined a swift victory. March in, conquer, march out before winter arrived. Others argue he believed the presence of his army alone would force surrender. Either way, no one packed enough coats, and certainly not enough working buttons. You remember the day your second greatcoat failed. The buttons, brittle from constant freezing and thawing, cracked in half. One shattered entirely when you brushed it against a tree. You stared at the jagged edge in disbelief, as though it had betrayed you personally. And yet, there was no time to mourn lost fasteners. The snow deepens, the air gets sharper, and soon people stop bothering with uniforms at all. You see elite guards wrapped in whatever cloth they can find. Blankets, rugs, even pieces of broken tents. The ornate embroidery of just weeks ago? Gone, covered in frost or torn off to be burned. You see someone trying to start a fire with a bundle of decorative fringe and feel something close to grief. And the buttons? They vanish like coins in water. There's a fringe theory you hear one night, huddled around a pitiful flame, that some soldiers began trading buttons again. Not for soup this time, but for kindness. One fellow swaps a surviving brass cuff button for a dry pair of socks. Another trades two for a place closer to the fire. It's not barter. It's tribute, an unspoken acknowledgement of loss and survival. You hold onto your last decent button for as long as you can. You rub it each night, keeping it warm in your hand like a talisman. One night, delirious from cold, you try to remember what the eagle engraved on it even meant. Glory? Empire? Was that even still relevant? But your thoughts trail off like steam into the air. And then there's the moment you see him, Napoleon himself. He's riding ahead, surrounded by the remaining staff, all looking more ghost than man. His coat is still gray, still long, still buttoned. But even now, you notice, one of the top buttons is gone, missing, just an empty thread fray where it used to be. And that, more than anything, tells you this isn't just a retreat. It's an unraveling. Even the myth is fraying. Later, you'll hear whispers, maybe true, maybe not, that upon returning to Paris, the first thing Napoleon did was commission a new coat, identical to the old one, all buttons replaced, not for warmth, for image, because he knew the coat had to be whole even if the man wasn't. Scholars still debate whether the Moscow retreat marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon, or merely his greatest test. You think it was both, because it wasn't just soldiers who froze out there, it was illusions, discipline, uniformity, but you survived. You, with your patched coat and scavenged fastenings and strange little rituals. Rubbing that button before sleep, even when sleep felt dangerous. You held on. And now, even years later, when someone asks what it was like out there, you don't talk about the cold, or the dead, or the endless white. You talk about that last button, because it meant something long after everything else stopped. You never thought you'd see it, but here it is, an island full of pockets. It's Elba, your emperor's exile, and strangely enough, his personal tailoring playground. You've followed Napoleon as far as anyone could go. But even here, even in defeat, he cannot resist tinkering with uniforms. The man is technically a prisoner, sure, but you wouldn't know it from the way he struts around the courtyard in his crisp new coat. Fully buttoned, naturally, and with so many compartments it might qualify as luggage. Welcome to Napoleon's wardrobe in exile. If you thought imperial fashion peaked during his reign, you were wrong. Here on Elba, stripped of armies and power, Napoleon turns his energy to a much smaller domain, his clothes. And for a man who once redrew the map of Europe, a waistcoat with 12 pockets is practically a consolation prize. Historians still puzzle over it. Why, after losing nearly everything, would Napoleon spend so much time fussing over his outfits? Was it vanity? Routine? A psychological coping mechanism? They still argue whether his Elban uniforms were a desperate attempt to cling to control, or just what he needed to stop from unraveling completely. Either way, the evidence is undeniable. He redesigned the local militia uniforms personally. They're part military, part Napoleon fan club, complete with buttons emblazoned with a crowned N, and lapels so sharp they might as well be weapons. Some say he even insisted that the local tailor reinforce the pocket linings with extra stitching, so they could carry more documents. Or dried figs. Or pride. You, now assigned to his household staff, are tasked with organizing his wardrobe. It's like being inside a tailor's fever dream. Coats of every length. Capes for every occasion. And the pockets, oh, the pockets. Some are hidden behind layers of decorative braid. Others sit invisibly in the seams. One jacket, perhaps your favorite, has a slim vertical slit under the collar that holds a tightly rolled message. You only know because you accidentally sneezed and discovered it. There's a new rhythm to life on Elba. Fewer marches, more measuring tapes. The tailor visits weekly. Napoleon sketches ideas on napkins, scrap paper, even the back of old dispatches. One day he asks whether a coat can be made reversible, gray on one side, white on the other, for mood changes. You assume he's joking. He's not. You begin to suspect that this obsession with uniforms is less about fashion and more about memory. Each coat is a keepsake, a reminder of who he was and maybe who he still thinks he is. The morning rituals say it all. Napoleon rises early, dresses slowly, thoughtfully, chooses a coat not for weather, but for message. The blue one with the reinforced shoulders when receiving foreign visitors. The tan double-pocketed waistcoat when inspecting his small navy. A charcoal coat with silver thread buttons for his evening walks, always worn with gloves tucked, never in the left pocket. There's a fringe tale whispered among the staff that he once re-wore his old imperial greatcoat, the one from his victorious days, and just stood at the mirror, fastening the buttons one by one, saying nothing for nearly half an hour. You believe it, because the clothes aren't just garments anymore. They're stories. Armor made of routine. Every button a chapter. Every pocket a hidden thought. The locals find it fascinating. Tailors offer their services. Children try to mimic the cut of his coat with scraps. One Elban merchant begins selling replica Napoleon pockets. Small pouches stitched to the inside of linen shirts. Tourists buy them. Irony is lost on no one. And yet, for all his meticulous dressing, there's always something slightly off. A button sewn too tightly. Pocket that bulges where it shouldn't. A man in uniform with nowhere to march. The coat fits, but the world no longer does. You start to notice the signs. He fidgets more. Refolds lapels. Straightens buttons that are already straight. Reaches into empty pockets. as if trying to summon the empire he once carried there. Elba cannot contain him, not really, not his mind, not his legacy, not even his style. Then one day word arrives he's leaving, escaping, returning to France. You help him pack. The coats go first. He selects one of his favorites, a dark blue military tunic with polished buttons and a deep interior pocket stitched by hand. You remember that pocket. You reinforced it yourself. Held maps once. It might hold history again. As the boat pulls away, you catch a final glimpse of the Emperor standing tall at the prow, wind tugging at his coat, hand resting precisely inside the same pocket that launched 1,000 campaigns. You can't help but think, exile was temporary. But the buttons were always permanent. The end comes not with a bang, but with creaking floorboards and quiet footsteps in a damp house on a rocky island. Napoleon is no longer marching, no longer reviewing troops or inspecting uniforms. Now he walks slowly through rooms that echo with history and mildew. This is St. Helena, lonely, remote, and entirely pocketless in spirit. And yet the buttons remain. Even in exile, real exile this time, Napoleon dresses carefully. His wardrobe has dwindled, but his habits have not. The man may no longer be emperor, but you'd never know it from the way he fastens his coat each morning. One button at a time, always the same sequence, always the same pause before the last one. You're part of the household staff again, one of the few who made it this far. You help organize the small collection of uniforms he brought with him. For coats, 2 waistcoats, 1 pair of boots that barely holds together. All of them show signs of wear, but the buttons? Still polished. He insists on it. Even as his health fades, even as the island's damp air rusts everything else, the buttons gleam. You polish them while he naps, gently, reverently, as if they're relics. Maybe they are. There's a peculiar dignity to this routine. Dressing, sitting, undressing, repeating. No battles, no pageantry, just the quiet ritual of fastening one's history to their chest. Historians still debate what these last years meant. Was Napoleon defeated, diminished, or simply biding time with the only power he had left? Control over how he appeared. Some argue the uniform was all he had, the final thread tying him to glory. Others say it was stubborn vanity. You think it was something deeper, a kind of defiance. If he couldn't rule the world anymore, he could at least look like he still did. One morning, he asks for his green colonel's coat, the one with the wide lapels and the eagle-stamped buttons. He doesn't wear it often now. It's tight at the shoulders, loose at the waist. His body has changed, but he wants it. You help him into it slowly. He doesn't speak, just holds out his arms, lets you fasten the buttons. 1, 2, 3. The top one resists slightly. You press it through the worn hole and he nods just once. Then he sits, staring out the window toward the sea, the wind playing gently with the edge of his collar. A few weeks later, he's bedridden, feverish, thin. Still, he insists on keeping a jacket nearby. You drape it over the chair by his bedside. Occasionally, he reaches out, fingers brushing the brass discs. He doesn't have the strength to lift it anymore, but his hand knows where each button is. The day he dies, you are the one who closes his coat. Not for battle, not for inspection, for memory. You take your time as you always have. Line everything up. Smooth the fabric. Fasten the top button last, as he always preferred. The room is silent, save for the ticking of a small clock and the wind slipping through the shutters. Later, when they prepare his body for the funeral, you're told to remove the coat. Fold it. Set it aside. But you don't. You leave it on. Because it was never just clothing. It was never just buttons. It was him. They bury him with it. Years later, the British open the tomb, transporting his remains back to Paris. The coat, remarkably, still intact. The buttons still in place. One scholar writes that Napoleon was buried in uniform as he lived in command even of the silence. Another, more skeptical, suggests that burying him in his coat was a final indulgence of theatricality. But you know the truth. It wasn't theater. It was identity. A man reduced, broken, and aged, but never undressed. Even in death, Napoleon was buttoned. Even in death, he remained fastened to the myth he had stitched so carefully. And now, as the story settles and the march of thread and brass fades into stillness, you find yourself adrift in a quieter time. The sound of drums has vanished. The gold trim no longer glitters. The snow has melted away. You feel the weight of the coat lift from your shoulders, just a little. The buttons loosen gently, not torn, just released. It's strange, isn't it? How something so small, so ordinary, can hold so much of a man. A button, pocket, a place to keep the world just a little more manageable. You imagine Napoleon now, no longer a figure of power or exile, but something smaller, softer. Perhaps resting in a quiet room, the air still, a breeze lifting one edge of his old greatcoat. Not from war, not from wind, just from peace. Your own breath slows. You shift slightly under your blanket, or maybe you're in a coat of your own. A cocoon of warmth and quiet. The story is still there, but its edges blur, fading like old stitching. No more inspections, no more snow, no more history to carry for now. Just a single button, shining in the dark, like a star that forgot to burn out. Sleep comes slowly, like the final fastening of a coat. Soft, secure, complete.